is similar. See if everybody can see it. There it is. I wish you could smell it because it smells good too. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Linda Starkweather. Thank you for being here, Linda. Linda has been, by turns, a fine artist, graphic artist, stage designer, and set builder. Actor for venues, Kalamazoo, Michigan, Rochester, Naples, New York, and North Central Florida. She was a high school teacher of theater and film production and has been a guest artist opening up the world of Shakespeare to fifth graders in the Rochester area. She is a jeweler, builder, and a mixed media artist in semi-retirement. At this point on her journey, she is turning her attention to the topic of death, both literal and figurative, and those surrounding themes of vitally full living and death with dignity, curiosity, and serenity. Here's Linda with Speaking of Death.
Thank you. Can you still see me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for your patience. So we're all living in a new world, electronic world that we can be thankful for right now. And I'm really happy to be invited to speak with you today. There is one huge question that has bothered me since I was a kid. My parents and I went to Sunday school and church almost every week, but I became aware at an early age that everyone wants to go meet Jesus, but nobody wants to get on the bus. Death and dying, even with a promise of a glorious eternity, is an unsettling mystery, therefore a forbidden topic, especially in our culture. As an only child of loving but detached parents, I think I first became painfully aware of the anxiety our culture has in talking about death and dying when I was 11. It was Christmas Eve, and we had traveled the 150 miles to my grandma Ruth's house to spend the holiday with extended family. When we arrived, my dog and my best friend, Sandy, was acting pretty strange. My parents probably knew that she was old and sick, but had never talked to me about the possibility of her dying. I'm sure they wanted to protect me from that reality in order to not ruin my Christmas. So, early evening, my uncle and my father took Sandy to the vet. I waited anxiously for them to return, and within an hour they were back, without my dog. No one explained anything. And I was too afraid to ask. I decided to believe that she was at the doctor's overnight to be treated. To this day, I can't remember how or when or who finally told me that they had to put her down, a phrase that I've always found curious. I, of course, was devastated. I was also now privy to the practice of death denial that has plagued humans since time immemorial. As far as we know, humans are the only creatures that are acutely aware of their own mortality. Although I suspect that elephants, whales, and dolphins might be more sentient than we can imagine. I have a confession. I am a person who likes to reduce the big questions in life to the simplest, least complex answers. I believe that most of life's big mysteries can be reduced to an uncomplicated, accessible explanation. And one question I have grappled with since I was a kid is, why is there so much evil in the world? I finally asked what books I've read that changed my life. And the first that always comes to mind, especially in these iniquitous times, is Ernest Becker's treatise on the denial of death. I was assigned the book during my freshman year in college and reread it 30 years later while working on a master's degree. Ernest Becker was an American writer and cultural anthropologist. He won the 1974 Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Denial of Death, and followed it with a sequel called Escape from Evil. In it, he argues that the basic motivation for human behavior is our biological need to control our most basic anxiety, to deny the reality and the terror of our own mortality. Then Becker continues, to have emerged from nothing, to have a name, consciousness of self, deep inner feelings, an excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression, and with all of that, yet to die. Becker suggested that a significant function of culture is to provide successful ways to engage in death denial. He then suggests that all evil that exists is born out of our basic terror and our denial of our own mortality. The real world is simply too terrible to admit. It tells man that he is a small, trembling animal who will someday decay and die. Culture changes all of that, makes man seem important, vital to the universe, immortal in some ways. We see this being played out right now in our country, in the midst of the pandemic, by those who arm themselves and rush to the state capitals insisting on their right to go back to work, or their golf games, or the beaches, or for a haircut. Believing themselves impervious to death, they also believe that those they will infect will not die either. This is perhaps the clearest evidence we have that death denial actually propels many to defiantly charge into their own demise. And of course, one of the most potent and prevailing mechanisms to mitigate our fear of dying was to create religion, with all of its rules and prescriptions for earning eternal life. Religion itself had its origin in relation to death by introducing a belief system that helps to reduce the fear of it, to promise a gilded, eternally peaceful afterlife. But as we know from ancient history to the current perverse evangelical fervor we see today, religion has been used to have power over others, to condone war, slavery, misogyny, unbridled wealth, racism, dominion over the earth, her resources, and her animals. For example, the king might say to his conquests, "I have the power of life and death over you," when in reality, he only has the power of death to execute his enemies. The real power of life lies solely with the feminine, the one who gives birth, the mother of the defeated and of the king. This, in short, explains one potent feminist theory of misogyny. Women have the ultimate power, and men for millennia have been trying to overturn that universal truth. The frantic, desperate, and sometimes violent proselytizing of a belief system seems to me to betray the underlying fear that it is all a sham, and that in order to continue believing, they must recruit everyone to share those beliefs. Our God is the only God. And those of us that believe differently or are non-believers create an existential terror for the pious, because they might, in fact, be wrong. Interestingly, a recent study by researchers out of the University of Oxford examines all available data on how fearful we are of what happens once we shuffle off this mortal coil. Not surprisingly, they find that atheists are among those least afraid of dying. Second to religion, as a way of coping with our fear of death denial, is nationalism, war, and the drive toward heroism. Wars have been fought to defend a culture's religious beliefs or to obtain more land and more taxable subjects, a greater following. Because any threat to a culture's belief system, either political or religious, would mean symbolic annihilation and death of the ego. This explains why throughout history our young men, and sadly now our young women, would sign up to march off to war and possible death. It is counterintuitive to take up arms as a means of death denial, but becoming part of something bigger than oneself, especially in the service of God and country, is an insurance policy that one will live eternally as a hero and a worthy crusader. They might erect a statue in your hometown and tell stories of your heroism for decades to come. Your medals of bravery will be passed down for generations. Becoming a hero is one's chance at immortality, to live on, at least in the hearts and minds of others. Becker explains that humanity has a unique quality distinct from all other animals. We distrust even when no immediate danger is present. We see this now playing out in the world stage, making people of different belief systems or cultures or religious doctrines the enemy, without proof of harm or malfeasance. As humanity steps closer to the possibility of extinction, we deny that we all are the real enemy, the ones poisoning the planet, turning on our neighbors, allowing our fears to govern. Just look at almost every single science fiction film that has as its villains the hostile space aliens. Of course, in Hollywood, they are most often portrayed as a threat, so there is the opportunity for the ultimate battle, for great action sequences, and for a human hero to emerge and save humanity. This innate fear has paved the way for our military-industrial complex to thrive. We cannot vote to eliminate death, but we can continually create an enemy to conquer, a foreigner to shun, or a race or lifestyle to demean, thus distracting us from some very real and serious threats like, well, the imminent collapse of our democracy, the threat of environmental disasters caused by man-made climate chaos, and the awareness that in our current cultural and economic divide, there is little common ground. Our death-defying coping tools are many. Surprisingly, shopping still seems to fend off anxiety, at least for a while. Endorphins are actually released with each purchase, and the addiction is aided by our uniquely American religion of consumerism. You might remember one of the many caricatures that arose in the years since 9/11 is the exhortation that President Bush's primary charge to the American people in the aftermath of that tragedy was simply to go shopping, as if keeping our economy strong was a remedy for our outrage and grief. Controlling nature has always been at the core of our death anxiety. Nature is awe-inspiring, but she was also terrifying. Mother Nature is brutal, violent, relentless. She is who destroys what she creates. We have sought to conquer nature in order to create a false sense of power and control over her. Feminists understand this and have linked it to the ever-violent treatment of all women, including our Mother Earth. The climate crisis denial of many of our citizens is also the denial of death, as we now stand on the brink of a potentially real human extinction. We have plundered, raped, and abused our mother until she is gasping for breath. Perhaps the COVID virus is her way of communicating what is happening to her lungs as we deforest the Amazon, the literal lungs of our planet. We imagine that God will somehow intervene or that technology will solve our problems and save us without changing consuming habits and the status quo. Remember the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results, right? Hoarding seems to be a particularly modern form of death denial. piling things around us like some medieval wall that will somehow protect us from the grim reaper, or an actual wall, say at our southern border to keep the scary foreign people away. The fact that we have hoarded enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world several times over has to tell us something about our own fear of this nameless enemy. Are we, as a warring nation, simply trying to fend off our most basic terror, that of our own death? We watch in repulsion the TV reality shows that spotlight people who have turned to hoarding after experiencing a stressful life event that they had difficulty coping with, such as the death of a loved one or a painful divorce. And yet we venerate those self-made billionaires who are hoarding resources of another kind. I truly believe that the current 8 billionaires that own more than half of the world are the most terrified of all men. And it looks like both the wealthy, mostly white men, and the poorest, mostly white men, are afraid of something almost as terrifying as death: the loss of their belief systems, their control, and their power over others. The violence and acts of terror we see from them today are symptoms of a changing world that redefines, thus terrorizes them. A revolution that asks them to share their power, their status, and their wealth for the common good. And the existential, unconscious behavior that this change ignites is beyond our imagination and is being played out in our daily domestic lives and in our political arenas. Xenophobia, racism, and the attempt to limit women's rights and freedoms are symptoms of death denial and the uniquely human terror that power attempts to assuage. Even eating animals is a death denial of sorts, because we do not have to think about those animals' tortured lives or their deaths. We do not have to think about factory farming's impact on our environment, nor do we contemplate the mind-blowing fact that we kill as many animals in 2 years as there are stars in the galaxy. 70 billion animals a year, not including sea creatures, are murdered for our insatiable appetites and our precious preferences. We don't think about the amount of water that is used on the front end of factory farming, nor do we think about the pollution caused by the methane and the runoff from these factories. Methane, incidentally, is 86 times more harmful than carbon dioxide and is a major contributor to global warming. Another result of our death denial includes our obsession with staying alive, and often results in useless, painful medical intervention, especially toward the end of our lives. 90% of healthcare costs in the United States are accrued in the last 90 days of a person's life. Drugs, tests, and procedures promoted to extend life are more often than not extending our death and our suffering. The current suspected mortality rate of COVID-19 patients who were intubated and put on ventilators now hovers between 70 and 90%. That's the mortality rate. After death, the funeral industry pumps our dearly departed full of chemicals and applies makeup to create the illusion of life for the mourners. Some spend exorbitant amounts of money on coffins, mausoleums, and plots for internment, hoping that our progeny will visit and not forget us. Stephen Jenkinson, author of the book Die Wise, reminds us that humans in these modern times are the only species that does not give back to the earth when we die. I have been aware of my own existential angst since I was a kid. As a result, I became an addict, a TV addict. I would sneak the TV into my bedroom at night when the terror became overwhelming and watch Ozzie and Harriet, or Father Knows Best, or Leave It to Beaver. in order to stave off my anxiety and fear about death and the possibility of nothingness. Those TV families seemed happy and oblivious to the night terrors I was experiencing, and that was my first willing foray into the denial of death. But in recent years, there have been two things that I have found quite comforting. The first was learning of a question the Greek philosopher Lucretius posed. He asked, "Were you afraid of the time before you were born?" No. Then why would you be afraid of the time after you die? The second is the Buddhist teaching that we are of a nature to grow old, we are of a nature to become ill, we are of a nature to die. What a relief. I love this because this teaching is about the end of suffering and of our anxiety. On a lighter note, as I'm sure we could all use at this point, I want to tell you about an interesting and I believe timely movement. How many of you out there have ever heard of or attended a death cafe? Well, death cafes are intimate gatherings now held all over the world for the purpose of bringing death out of the dark, taboo closet and into the light. Small groups are convened in a festive gathering, providing a chance to talk about this most grave topic, pun intended. These are not morbid gatherings at all, but are a very alive, engaging, and often hilarious conversation about death and dying with a small group of friends or strangers in an informal setting. My partner Lynn and I have hosted several of these gatherings here in Florida and in our home state of New York. They have been engaging, tender, informing, hilarious, and evidence that mortality is a topic that many have been dying to discuss. Talking about death won't kill you, but not talking about it may result in a life less fully lived and appreciated. The more we recognize, accept, and incorporate the reality of death, the more precious and vivid our lives can become. And perhaps the evil that is so ubiquitous in our world will begin to wane. May it be so. Namaste.
That was good.
There you go. You can talk now. That was great. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Linda. That was great.
Thank you.
That was nice. I appreciated that. And I wrote down a couple of the names of the books that we were talking about. And, yeah, the escape from evil kind of is very interesting to me in these days. Is there somebody else that would like to say something to Linda? Carol Goodwin. Are you unmuted, Carol? I think you're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes. Hello.
Hi, Carol.
Hi. Hi, Linda. Do you remember us? Renee's here too. Yeah.
I sure do. Your picture's really tiny on the screen, but I sure do.
Play it in. Oh. Oh wait. Did I?
I'm not in it.
No, I'm on video. I'm sorry. I can't.
That's okay.
I can't. I don't know how to do anything about that. Very good. Very excellent talk. Really enjoyed that.
Let's talk about it now.
But usually what happens is the person that's talking, you see them on the screen, but it's not happening today for me at least.
No.
So I see Linda on the screen, but I don't see anybody else.
Well, you've got some choices down on the bottom
Now I
bar.
see me.
Linda,
Reaction,
is Jeannie right? This
share scheme.
Jeannie right. Yeah, something that we have an old canoe that's very big out on the side of our yard that we probably are not going to be using anymore just because of the logistics of getting it onto the car. We're almost, both of us are almost close to 80. And it's sitting out there making us feel very guilty because we should be, you know, out there. Of course, the river is closed now, but your talk is sort of, are we gone? Your talk let me know that this is one of our little guilt things to get rid of if it's making us not live fully now. And that's great. Thank you.
Well, you know, you're welcome. I think it's very interesting. There's, at least in our world, we've been moving in, and I think, you know, Unitarians are kind of on the wave of all this. There's been a movement to pare down. A lot of people are realizing that all the stuff we've been told that was going to make us a successful American are really nothing more than kind of an anchor on us now. And that we're all thinking about paring down and living more simply. And sometimes it's hard when you see people going on their 5th and 6th cruise a year. And I know we all love cruising, but it's one of the things that's probably the most harmful to our environment. And, you know, the old saying is, we can't fix what we don't know. So as we learn more, we do better.
I
Well,
like the way you tied it into Mother Earth too. That was a great analogy. I worked as a hospice for many years, and it's almost as if we don't address death until the end, and then we realize that we have all this stuff, and what will we?
No, yeah, the speaker, but not the person who's actually talking.
That last one.
You're muted.
I know.
You heard her.
She needs to unmute.
She was talking. We heard her.
I can hear.
I don't know who it was.
I couldn't see who it was.
It was Pam.
That was Pam and David. That was Pam Reeder talking.
Oh, okay.
I had a thought about the canoe. I thought you were going to use it as a future coffin.
Oh, what a brilliant
Like
idea.
these Scandinavians who set out to sea when they're feel they're dying.
South Pacific, they put you on a boat and put you out into the ocean.
Right.
Well, or you can turn it into a garden too. You can make it a raised bed, and you can turn it into a garden.
I think you should just put it out there for free for someone and let someone use it.
Well, you know,
For those of you who have been to museums and have seen a very rare thing, which is a very huge cradle, would look like a baby cradle, only really big. I just learned about this. In the olden days, when someone was dying and they wanted to keep them close to the family in the kitchen, dining room area where all the activity was, they would build a huge cradle for them so they could be rocked and soothed. And when they did die, the lid was put on the cradle and that became their coffin.
For heaven's sake.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
They make coffee tables like that nowadays too.
Another thing I thought was interesting. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was saying they make
Another
coffee
thing I thought was interesting.
tables that are double as
You know, I think we need to have the coordinator have us raise our hands and then they open it up.
We're getting echoes. Yeah. Okay. So, let's see, participants.
Here's their raised hand.
Can you do that? Can you block us all until we put our hand up on this little raise my hand?
I don't know. I don't know if I can do that. Maybe Dawn can?
I'm not sure.
Actually,
Then he can open it up to each of us who have our hand raised.
you can mute, but
Well, you raise your hand by touching on the participants, I guess.
Well, on the participants, there's a little thing that says hand raise. and it'll click over your hand up. Like on the right-hand side.
In one